as academics, we spend so much of our time identifying ourselves as our career. Like, I am an expert in this field, or I am like the world's top person in this, and I travel around the world and I talk about this, and I got invited to conferences because I am this person. I was like, whoa, I don't have to be that person anymore. I can just be myself, and myself is so much more than my professional expertise. And why did I lose sight of that? So that was a really powerful thing to me, and that completely changed my life.
Welcome to the Personal Finance for PhDs podcast, a higher education in personal finance. I'm your host, Emily Roberts. This is Season 3, Episode 8, and today my guest is Dr. Gov Worker, which is the moniker used by a PhD scientist and FIRE blogger. FIRE stands for Financial Independence and Early Retirement. Gov Worker and I had such an engaging and in-depth conversation that I've split it into 2 episodes, this one and next week's. In this episode, Gov Worker tells us what FIRE is, what pushed him to pursue it, and what his family does to pursue it. Without further ado, here's the first part of my interview with Dr. Gov Worker. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. I have the great pleasure of having a conversation today with someone who goes by the moniker Gov Worker. Maybe we should say Dr. Gov Worker. And this person, Gov Worker, I really wanted to find someone to talk to us about FIRE, which is Financial Independence, Retire Early, which is a really big trend right now in the personal finance movement. And it's actually come up on a couple of our previous episodes, one with Dr. Amanda and one with Krista Wathen. And so I wanted to find someone who would really speak to this specifically. And thankfully, Gov Worker and I have a mutual connection on Twitter, and I found him through that person. So Gov Worker, thank you so much for joining us this morning. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Would you please tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Emily. Before we get started, I should say that I'm speaking in my personal capacity, and my views are not representing the government, so they're my own views. So I'm a government researcher. I got my PhD in 2009. I live in a flyover state and am happily married with 3 daughters. That's kind of, having kids, or 3 kids, is kind of rare for FIRE, so we can talk about that later on. I started blogging just a few months ago because I realized, while there's a lot of FIRE bloggers and there's a lot of people in the personal finance space pursuing FIRE, a lot of them aren't like me necessarily, in that they have a PhD or that they have a government job. And these are things that make pursuing FIRE different from typical scenarios. So I wanted to kind of write content that would help people in these type situations like optimize their decisions for pursuing FIRE.
Yeah, I'm so happy to hear that. That actually matches really well with the reasons why I started blogging about personal finance back in 2011. Not my current website, but the one before that. Some listeners may be aware of my previous site, evolvingpf.com. And I was getting really interested in the personal finance space at that, in the couple years leading up to that time. And I also didn't see myself as a graduate student represented in the space, not even just as a graduate student, but as kind of a lower earner. Most of the people I saw writing, I would say I was in the bottom 1% in terms of incomes of the people I saw writing about personal finance, which kind of makes sense for a few different reasons. But anyway, so that's very similar to why I started writing. And I'm so glad that you did, because as we'll talk about, and you mentioned, you sort of defy a couple of the stereotypes about FIRE, which we're happy to go into. So first, for our audience who has no idea what FIRE is, can you give a really brief definition?
Yeah, so FIRE is an acronym for Financial Independence and Early Retirement. I guess they switched the R and the E. So in my mind, those are 2 really separate goals, but they kind of get lumped in together as one acronym and one movement.
When I first started learning about personal finance, being financially independent meant being financially independent from your parents. It was like a young adult goal, right? So go into what each of these things means, please.
Right, so financial independence is a state of being where you have passive income. So that's income that your money is making for you that exceeds your living expenses. So, I mean, in that essence, like even if you retire at 62 and live off of Social Security, you're, I guess, in some ways financially independent at that age because you're not earning money and you're living off of income that you don't have to work for. So that's passive income. And in the FIRE movement, um, it's kind of roughly, the rule of thumb is if you have 25 times your living expenses saved, that you can generate enough returns on your investment to live comfortably off withdrawing 4%. So 25 times your expenses are 4% of your liquid net worth. That's kind of this financial independence. And some people debate whether it should be 25 or 30 or some multiple, but you can look up a whole bunch of stuff on that. But this idea is that you amass a pile of money and that money makes money and you live off of what that money makes for you. And it could be through like rental properties, it could be through stock market returns, it could be through like dark arts, I don't know, but the like goal of the FIRE movement is to save enough money that your money works for you and you don't have to work for a living. Or you don't have to, you can work, but it doesn't have to earn money. So you could do things that don't make money, like blogging or something that you really enjoy doing, and create things, but it doesn't have to, it could be disassociated from a paycheck because your money is earning your living expenses.
Yeah, and there's the key difference between financial independence and early retirement, right? In early retirement, you are committed to not working anymore. Whereas in financial independence, it's just an option. You can work more, you can not, you're good either way. Is that right?
Yeah, and I mean, I think there's kind of a joke in the FIRE movement about this internet retirement police that like if you do achieve financial independence and you quit your main job. So like if I stopped becoming a government researcher because I reached financial independence, but I was still earning income doing other things, then, you know, internet trolls might say I'm not really retired. So early retirement is kind of a weird nebulous thing that I don't feel is very well defined. But I guess my goal is to achieve financial independence where I don't need to work if I don't want to. And then I can make a decision, well, do I want to work part-time? Do I want to work in an academic, lower stress environment? It, once you achieve financial independence, you have a whole bunch of options available, one of which is like completely quitting your profession and walking away forever, which is early retirement. But you could do like a phased retirement or some part-time work or something in your field that's different. So I think just achieving some space between, oh, I need this paycheck to live, and working because you have to and working because you want to is really important. And so even if you're not pursuing early retirement, I think it's really worth trying to pursue FIRE. Because even if you don't reach financial independence, say you're starting off with a lot of debt or starting off from a different space and you think financial independence is really far away, if you work towards that, even just getting 6 months salary saved up gives you options if you're in a toxic work environment. And so I think if FIRE doesn't resonate to you as a listener, like don't just shut off the podcast, because there's a lot of good that can come from working towards getting in a better financial space. And that's why I think the movement is so important for everyone, even if early retirement is not for everyone.
Yeah, great point. Because when I first heard about this movement in, I don't know, 2012, 2013, something like that, um, it was, I don't even think the acronym FIRE was being used at that time, because really people were talking about early retirement. And I wrote a post for my site that was like, early retirement, I don't care about that. That's not for me. Um, and I'm going to dismiss this whole movement. But actually, I had a commenter on that post come back and say, well, no, Emily, like you are pursuing financial independence. You might not be pursuing it particularly early or whatever, but obviously by wanting to generate more financial security for yourself, being aggressive about saving for retirement, you are pursuing financial independence. So don't dismiss this movement. And frankly, it's based on some of the stereotypes that I heard about the movement at that time, which we can discuss. So these stereotypes that you still see in the media today are like, well, FIRE is being pursued by young, male, single, childless tech workers, engineers, that kind of thing. It's not for people who have lower incomes. It's not for people who have families. It's not for people who live in high cost of living areas. So I know, I mean, you brought this up earlier, like let's dispel some of those stereotypes.
Yeah, I mean, I think you put it very kindly, but I mean, yeah, I would say like a single white male who learned to code and got a really high paying job and is maybe even antisocial, so like doesn't even fully understand these like things that people want to spend money on. And there's nothing wrong with spending money on things on the path to fire if that's what brings you happiness. It's about, in my mind, financial independence is about spending money on what makes you happy and then like not spending money on other things just because other people spend money on them. So I think the stereotype, and then these people like not only are they in the mainstream media but are on social media and comment, I think there's a lot of this like bootstrap mentality that like, well, I make all this money, and so if you don't do it, then you aren't working hard because I was able to do this, which ignores a lot of privilege and other factors that go into this. And if you want to find out about fire and that is like the first resource you find and it doesn't resonate with you, there are tons of people pursuing financial independence or fire, and you just need to find a story that resonates with you, because there are stories about, you can find people's that are blogging and being really open about destroying mountains of debt they have, student debt, credit card debt, any kind of debt, and those stories are really powerful. You can find like there's a lot of diversity in the bloggers, and so everybody's got these really great stories, and you just got to find one that resonates with you and helps you, that you can put yourself in your like that person's shoes and like be like, yeah, they're doing these things and we are going through the same problems, and that's inspiring me to like work on my finances. And I just, if I could like help anyone on this podcast, just tell them that there's somebody out there that's probably writing a story that's very similar to theirs. They should like go find this person and not just immediately get turned off right away by this fire, because like early retirement sounds so extreme and you're like, oh, I can never do that, I have debt, or I can never do that, like I'm first generation college, or I could never do that because I grew up in this really bad neighborhood. Like there's people who are writing about those exact situations, and I just want to let people know it's way more inclusive than you might think of if you just hear it like off the news or something.
Yeah, we hear so much in academia, in science, about the importance of having models and mentors who you can identify with on some of these, demographic factors, for example. So I so appreciate your point that, like, yeah, don't get turned off by, one random article that you read that only features, this type of person. Like, there's so many different types of people in this movement, and it's important for everyone, really. So let's go down to into what more specifics about you, especially with you as a PhD, because it was a little bit hard for me to track down a PhD in the FIRE movement who is willing to talk about this. So I really want to have that aspect modeled for our listeners of how a PhD can pursue FIRE, or at least how you are as a PhD. So
Yeah.
let's start with what led you to this movement in the first place.
Money Magazine did a feature about the fire movement last year, and that was kind of the first exposure I've had to it. I know people have been writing about this, like Mr. Money Mustache is the most famous. He started in 2011. Um, and I just had never run across that. I mean, I've always been interested in finance. Like I got exposed to like the Rich Dad, Poor Dad books in like high school and was always thinking about, he's really big about passive income, but his books are kind of like, if you think hard enough, it will like, money will magically come to you or something. Um, but I mean, that kind of had this idea, and I was like, my wife and I are natural savers, but it never occurred to me that you could like retire early until I read this feature. Then I read Your Money or Your Life, which is like the key cornerstone book. It was written like I think 30 years ago by Vicki Robin. It's awesome. And that book completely changed my life, because at the time I was extremely stressed in my job. I was kind of experiencing burnout. I was having to travel a lot. Um, And I think like in academia or when you're getting your PhD, like it's just always implicitly assumed that you're gonna like try for like landing a major like R1 university job, or like the whole mindset of in my PhD experience is like you need to be the top of your field, and if or like you need to at least try to be the top of your field, and if you don't get there, well that's okay, because but it's never an option to just be like, well, I want to spend time with my family, or I want this, right? It's all about being the best. And I worked really hard on that for a decade. And it wasn't, and I guess objectively, I achieved a lot of career success, recognition and accolades and that kind of stuff, but it wasn't fulfilling because it wasn't ultimately what I wanted, but it was really hard for me to see that that wasn't what I wanted until I achieved career success and then realized, well, why did I just spend a decade pursuing that? But reading that book just really helped me rephrase things. There's a key concept in this book that like your job is just the place where you exchange your time for money. And I was like, whoa, like, because as academics, we like spend so much of our time identifying ourselves as our career. Like, I am an expert in this field, or I am like the world's top person in this, and I travel around the world and I talk about this, and I got invited to conferences because I am this person. And I was like, whoa, I don't have to be that person anymore. I can just be myself, and myself is so much more than my professional expertise. And why did I lose sight of that? So that was a really powerful thing to me, and that completely changed my life. So that was kind of how I discovered FIRE, and how it impacted me.
Yeah, of course. I want to add in something in response to that, though, first, which is that I had a sort of a similar experience in a different way during graduate school when I was learning more and more about personal finance, because one of these, I mean, really the bedrock concept in all of personal finance is regarding understanding what your own personal values are and aligning your use of money with your values, with what brings you the most satisfaction in your life. And I totally agree with you that inside academia, inside, work in science, our identity does become so closely tied with our profession that it's difficult to remember that you are a whole person with needs and desires outside of that. And for some people, their professional accomplishments and career success is the most important thing to them. But that's not everybody within academia. And I think for me, learning more about personal finance and realizing this caused me to do some more introspection. And it's one of the reasons why I, decided not to pursue a more traditional career following graduate school, and why instead I'm doing this, because I really love this, helping other people in my community make the most of their money. So I really resonate with that. It sounds like our exposure to the subject area, even though there are slightly different variations in personal finance, really caused a similar kind of change in both of us. This summer, I'm putting forth extra support for PhDs undergoing career transitions into grad school, a postdoc, or a real job. If you're moving on to the next stage in your career or thinking about it, please visit pfforphds.com/next to check out my articles, webinars, and coaching program. Allow me to come alongside you during this transition to ensure that you set yourself up for financial success. So yeah, I'd love to now dive into more about how one pursues FIRE, should one want to. So specifically for you, what are you doing on your path to FI?
Yeah, so let's see. So a couple things. So before even kind of pursuing the FI path, my wife and I are always very frugal. Like back when you could really coupon things, the like local newspaper did an article about my wife's like incredible couponing skills. And we've always lived way below our means because we didn't really feel the need to keep up with things. So like we both ride our bicycles to work, so we don't have to pay for parking or cars or stuff. We have a 10-year mortgage, which we're prepaying. And anytime we had gotten a raise, So when we started off our marriage, I got married pretty young, when I was still in graduate school. And my wife was working at the time, and we had like absolutely no money. But every time we got a raise, we would just say, well, we're living just fine. So we would save the raise in some account, like a savings account, or sometimes we increased retirement accounts or other things. Um, and so we're always just used to, when we got an increase, not increasing our standard of living. And it would always seem like we'd be doing really well financially and then have a baby, and then like a huge percentage of our salary would then go to daycare and kind of bump up that way. So in many ways, we're still living, well, we have improved our standard of living since like the depths of graduate school, but not by much. And every time we get a raise or a bonus or anything, it's like, how can we save it? And so that was what we had always done, and that's what fire people would tell you to do. Of course, the fire people are going to say like save it in a retirement account, but since we weren't necessarily focused on that goal, we would save it up for like improving something on the house, or maybe taking a vacation, or just saving it in a emergency fund or something else. So that stuff all kind of came naturally to us.
I want to go a little bit more in depth about a couple things you just mentioned. One is the time when you were in graduate school. So that's going to speak to a lot of my audience right now, currently in graduate school. Can you just talk a little bit more about how you managed to keep your living expenses in check when you did see an increase in income? Because I do think there's a tendency to, when you, let's say, get out of training. It sounds like your wife had a regular job. Maybe she was experiencing raises more frequently than you did as a graduate student. But like when you get that next position out of graduate school and there's a bigger bump in your salary, how were you not just like, I'm going to go like wild and really raise my standard of living and spend all of this because there's all this pent up demand or desire?
Yeah, I think it was probably, I think the first part of your comment did kind of address that. So um, my wife had a traditional job, or non, I mean, she's highly educated as well, but when I was in graduate school, she was working. Um, and so uh, I think my graduate school, I wasn't as destitute as if I were single and just living off of my stipend. It it also happened that I transitioned from graduate school into a job in the same city in which I graduated, so we didn't need to move or anything. So we were already living in a house at that time in the city, and my wife was making money. So it was kind of a real just, well, now I'm going to go here instead of over here. And it wasn't a wholesale change. So it wasn't like I was really really stretched and then got a job across the country and like, oh, I've got my first job and my first salary, and I'm gonna go crazy. It was really nice to have that bump. um, I mean, we were really stretched because we had my daughter about 2 years before I graduated, and so daycare was a huge cost, and that kind of stuff. So it gave us some financial breathing room when I did get my first job. um, and then getting kind of promotions, throughout my career since then, uh, has just given us more breathing room. I look back at my time in graduate school as, and maybe this is like selective bias and filtering out like bad experiences, because I know graduate school is very tough, not just financially but emotionally as well. But I do look back on a lot of the things we did socially then with, just happy, fond memories of kind of pulling together with this community of graduate students who was all kind of struggling and like having a really good time like that. And now that we're removed from graduate school and we're professionals and we have kids, and like the social interactions we have are like a lot different from those times. And so kind of keeping that framework and community together of people going through similar situations, I think is a really key thing to like keep in mind.
That was great, actually. And I just wanted to talk a little bit more about, you reflecting on that time to kind of make your current situation a little bit more relatable to my audience. Because, I mean, you could look at someone, a decade out from graduate school, who's on this path to financial independence and think like, what? Like, that's so far distant from where I am. I could never achieve that. I'm just a graduate student. I'm just a postdoc, whatever it is at this time. But that's why I wanted to like sort of make this connection to you back at that time. So it sounds like you were living in maybe a little bit better than the average grad student lifestyle because of your wife's job, and having these wonderful low cost experiences and social life with your fellow grad students, which I really love and miss as well. And then as you guys were increasing in your salaries at work, you only slightly maybe increased your standard of living. You didn't really move, at least right away, it sounds like. And really you just sort of kept living more or less the same lifestyle that you had during graduate school. This is something that I have talked about before on the podcast. For instance, in my interview with Dr. Brandon Renfro, we talked about really trying to keep lifestyle inflation, lifestyle creep in check when you receive those raises. So it's just good to have an example of someone who did that. Listeners, I'm so glad you joined us for today's episode. pfforphds.com/podcast is the hub for the Personal Finance for PhDs podcast. There, you can find links to all the episode show notes, a form to volunteer to be interviewed, a survey, and a way to join the mailing list. I'd love for you to check it out and get more involved. See you in the next episode. The music is Stages of Awakening by Poddington Bear from the Free Music Archive and is shared under CC by NC. Podcast editing and show notes creation by Jewel Lips.